We're at 6:04. So I want to, pardon? Are you guys ready to start?
Well, let's get going.
All right, well,
we're going.
I want to welcome everyone today. Thank you this evening for showing up. This is a very exciting time for us all. My name is Alina Hagler. I'm with Safer West County, which is hosting tonight's webinar and the subsequent sessions that you'll hear about as the speakers speak tonight. It's Beyond Defensible Space, a deep exploration into wildland field management. And this is a very, of course, expensive and critical topic for us in West County. As all of you know, there's been some fires already in Napa. And so we are all very interested in how we can do the fuel reduction in our communities and how we do it in an ecologically sensitive way. Safer West County in particular is very interested in having you join us. If you are in West County, there is a good way of getting a hold of us through saferwestcounty.org, our website. So if you want to hear more about how to join Safer West County, whether you are, as I am, in Guerneville or in Occidental or Camp Meeker or Forestville or Monterio or Cazadero, we would really love to have your participation as we try to build community around this very important topic. So we have some great speakers tonight. I'm going to let them introduce themselves. They have got a wealth of information, experience, and knowledge. And I know you will learn a great deal because I have personally learned a great deal from each of our speakers tonight. So without further ado, I will have John Carnegie start our session. Thank you, John.
And thank you, Alina. And thanks everyone for joining us. Thanks to Safer West County, for hosting this presentation about wildland vegetation management. And we couldn't do this without Fire Safe Sonoma and Roberta McIntyre, who's with us this evening, who recognize the importance of the topic and are providing support, funding support from TPW funds. As said, my name is John Carnegie. I'm a landscape designer and a horticulturalist with the Sonoma Ecology Center and a member of the Resilient Landscapes Coalition. A quick word before we get going about the Sonoma Ecology Center. If you're not familiar with us, our mission is to work with our community to identify and lead actions that achieve and sustain ecological health in Sonoma. We operate through community-supported research, restoration, education, and partnerships. A few housekeeping notes before we get started. This is a webinar format for a Zoom meeting, so you do not have audio or video activated. The webinar is being recorded, as has been said, and in fact is being live streamed. And we'll make, in an email that will follow a couple of days from now, we'll make available the link to that recording, but also it will be found very shortly on the Fire Safe Sonoma YouTube channel. A difference about the webinar format is that questions are best taken in a Q&A box. So if you hover down at the bottom, you'll see a Q&A. Please use that rather than chat. We'll use chat to communicate with you folks and share some links and other information, make some clarifications, things like that. Questions for us, it would be best managed if you put those into the Q&A box, please. This workshop and series of workshops is sort of an offshoot of the the work of the Resilient Landscapes Coalition, whose Defensible Space presentations, and we did one for Safer West County in September, have inspired this workshop. People have been asking, what do we do outside of the defensible space, that zone of 100 feet around your house? And so that question has inspired this workshop series. And I say series because this is a kickoff meeting to a series of 4 free workshops on this topic of fire resiliency and land stewardship. The next 2 events will be field workshops, which we haven't been doing as much lately, and so that'll be welcomed, I think, for all of us. The first of which is on Saturday, June 18th, as you see on the flyer, from 9 to 1, and that's at Santa Rosa Junior College's Schoen Farm Forest, hosted by Brianna Boaz, who's one of the presenters and organizers of this workshop series. The second of them will be on July 9th from 9 to 1 at Occidental Arts and Ecology Center, hosted by Brock Dahlman, who's also a speaker this evening. Space will be limited for these and will prioritize registration for West County residents, but we'll have a waiting list available for those interested in attending, but that are from outside the West County area. And then a 4th meeting will be held via Zoom webinar on the evening of July 27th. It'll feature land stewardship lightning consultations. A link for registration to the field workshops will be going into chat, or maybe it already has. Sorry, it's hard to speak and keep track of that. Yes, it has gone into chat. Thank you. And please stay tuned for registration information for that July 27 lightning consultation webinar. While these 4 workshops are sort of coordinated and we encourage you to attend all of them if you're able, or as many as possible, it's perfectly all right to attend whichever ones that you're able to. Additionally, we are curating a list of resources for landowners and managers, and that link is also going into the chat. All of these efforts are part of a larger project to prepare a best management principles and practices manual or document for Sonoma County wildlands. We're just getting started on that large project. All of the organizations that you're hearing from tonight, along with some others, are beginning work on this project that's funded by the County of Sonoma to enable landowners to make the best possible decisions about the long-term resilience of their land. This presentation could also be called Beyond Defensible Space, Reducing Wildfire Risk While Tending the Land for Wildlife and Natural Resources. West County folks are devoted to this idea and have specifically asked for this kind of content. So the question is, how do we protect human lives and property while at the same time paying attention to other things that are living here? What can we do to support and increase habitat and natural resources? To start the discussion of these questions, we'll have 4 speakers tonight with some time for questions and conversation at the end. I will start with an introduction to the topic and provide some ecological background and principles. And then I'll turn it over to Brock Dahlman from Occidental Arts and Ecology Center, who will talk about fire resiliency at landscape level experiences from OAEC. Next up will be a talk by Brianna Boaz, Professor of Natural Resources at Santa Rosa Junior College, speaking on fuel reduction and vegetation monitoring at the SRJC Schoen Farm. And then we're going to wrap up with a talk about regulatory aspects and land management tools. So unfortunately, Sashi Sabaratnam from UC Cooperative Extension is dealing with an illness. We wish her speedy recovery, and she's not able to join us. But we will have Mike Jones, who is a forestry advisor, also from UC Cooperative Extension. He's going to, on very short notice, I will add, fill in that component of the program, and then we'll wrap up with questions and conversation. I also want to note that Hannah Wilton from Occidental Arts and Ecology Center is providing support with us. She's been involved in the planning of this project from the beginning. She's the one that's feeding information into chat. Also, Ellie Inslee is a member of the board of directors for Sonoma Ecology Center. Again, sort of a founding member of this group and of this project, and she'll be moderating the question and conversation portion of the program. Okay. So there's a lot of fear and concern about wildfire, and it's very understandable that folks want to think first about going out into the forests and starting the work there to reduce the risks to their lives, their homes, and their property. Science tells us, though, that the most important approach to risks to the home is to start with home hardening and defensible space. So the first thing we should do with our resources of time and money is to work from the home out, first hardening the structure itself, thinking about things like roofing and fencing, deck materials, vents, and all of that. And then establishing defensible space, again, working with the landscape immediately around the home and working outwards. So those topics are different webinars from what we're doing tonight. We have links to the defensible space programs that we've done on the Resilient Landscapes Coalition website and also on our YouTube channel, including the one that we did for you folks, for the folks of Safer West County back in September. But all that said, there is stewardship work that's needed in our wildlands, and the combination of historic overgrazing, fire suppression have left us with forests of unhealthy vegetation density. Efforts to manage vegetation must now check multiple boxes: fire resiliency, climate resiliency, habitat, to name a few. We're focusing here on projects with high sensitivity to ecology as opposed to large-scale commercial logging and salvage logging type operations. All right, I'd like to frame this introduction to ecological principles with a discussion of patterns in a natural ecosystem, things like cycling of carbon and water, issues of complexity and biodiversity, and how these tend to result in regulation of populations. And I'll give some thoughts on disturbance and resilience. Let's start by recognizing the critical role of plants. As the slide here says, plants are not optional on this planet. Nearly every creature on Earth depends upon plants. All animals either eat plants or eat things that eat plants. And they're the only organisms that can capture the energy of the sun and take carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and use that carbon for growth and then release oxygen back into the air. That carbon is stored in the plant's tissues, providing food for the rest of us, and much of the carbon makes its way into the soil, where it can be stored for thousands of years and has obvious benefits to our climate crisis. The capacity of soil to hold carbon sort of in the bank, if you will, is just truly remarkable. The Earth's soils contain about 3 times the carbon that is in the atmosphere, about 4 times the amount that's in all of the living animals and plants combined. This graph compares the carbon above ground and below ground in various vegetation types. So remember that carbon in the soil all begins with plants, and we must manage our lands for wildland health and our cultivated lands with a carbon farm planning process. And it's also appropriate, I think, to apply the same kind of thinking to our home landscapes as well. Keep carbon on your soil, on your ground. So that's a carbon cycle, but trees also play a very critical role in the water cycle. Forests pump water from the ground, they filter it in doing so, and transpire water vapor up into the atmosphere. This results in the transportation of water resources from coastal areas towards the interior of continents. It also results in modification of the forest microclimate, as evidenced by the condensation of summer fog by redwood trees. Redwood trees are known to absorb moisture not only through their roots and from the soil, but absorbing it directly in their foliage from rain and fog. But all trees will physically intercept rainfall, reducing the impact of raindrops and slowing runoff, reducing soil erosion and protecting water quality. So we've got a carbon cycle, a water cycle. We can think also of nutrient cycles. And we can also think of disturbance as sort of cyclical events, things like fire, flood, pest outbreaks. And I'll talk about wildfire in a bit. So as has been said, all animals either directly or indirectly rely on plants for food. And not surprisingly, many ecologists have observed that a greater diversity of plants means a greater diversity of animals. And diversity generally leads to richness in relationships, processes, stability. An overly simplified forest lacks diversity, provides little habitat, and is at greater risk of pest outbreaks. This forest, shown here, while very park-like and has some lovely lupin, it lacks diversity and provides relatively little habitat. Now, I come from a background in agriculture and specifically vineyard management. And I look at a forest like that and I think of agricultural systems. It was pleasing to work in an agro-ecosystem with a perennial crop and the good possibility of a no-till floor, but it's still a very simplified system with a large reliance on regular inputs to preserve the productivity. Pesticides, fertilizers, water, labor, all of those things. So we should be careful to avoid oversimplifying forests in our vegetation management projects. When thinking about biodiversity and landscape complexity, let's start with a look at plant communities and recognize that there are several different communities here in the West County to consider. Starting with Chaparral there in the upper right, has tremendous biodiversity. It gets a rather bad reputation as a fire-dependent plant community with a pretty quick fire return interval, but it is a tremendous nursery for many animal species, has a lot of unique qualities, and landowners with this plant community should seek some good expert advice around wildland management in this case. There's also an oak woodland shown here in the bottom right with a brush pile to provide some wildlife cover and a mixed conifer forest. So each of these plant communities has its own relationship to diversity and complexity, and each needs a particular kind of tending. There isn't a one-size-fits-all formula here that we can learn and apply. This map shows the concentration of species that are most at risk of global extinction here in the lower 48 states. And you see how California, particularly the coastal areas, really light up due to its combination of human population pressures and the unique ecosystems that we have with many endemic species. According to the US Geological Survey, approximately 13% of the nation's lands are protected and managed for the conservation of biodiversity. And the Biden administration and the state of California independently have committed to goals to conserve and restore 30% of US lands and waters by 2030. But with 90% of Sonoma County privately owned, the efforts of private landowners here locally are going to be critical. This is a great image, beautiful image, a great image because so many animals rely on insects, either directly or indirectly for food. And without insects, there wouldn't be much other higher life. We've been hearing a lot lately about the significant loss of insect biodiversity, as much as 75 or 80% over the last several decades, with the example of Western monarch butterfly being pretty close on our minds. Studies have shown that the loss of habitat is a primary driver, along with pesticide use and climate change. It's important that we take steps to protect and create habitat as we manage wildland fuels. Speaking of eating insects, we're all familiar with the notion of a food web. I'd like this image as it reminds us that diversity at all levels is important. Plants and microorganisms, arthropods like insects, as well as vertebrates, and both above ground and below ground. In a well-functioning, balanced ecosystem, it's pretty rare that one member of the food web dominates the others. Natural herbivory and predation and disease, this notion of biological control, natural control, have evolved over millennia to result in the regulation of populations, at least in the absence of exotic species that can come in without their natural enemies. But not all interactions are about organisms consuming each other. This map shows a shared fungal network between Douglas fir trees in a British Columbia forest. The trees are shown by the green symbols. The straight colored lines between them represent the linkages between tree roots, and using mycorrhizal fungi, with each color of the line representing different but similar genetics. This sort of complex relationship is known to allow communication between plants, signaling, for example, a pest outbreak and inducing a response to connected trees. One of the ways to create this diversity is with complexity in habitats. This document can provide inspiration. This is Wildlife-Friendly Fuels Reduction. It's a terrific report written for the Pacific Northwest. As I mentioned earlier, we are initiating a project to adapt this type of work. I referred to a handbook or a manual. This type of work is what we're hoping to, or planning to do over the next about 12 to 18 months for Sonoma County plant communities. So this document, and a link to it should be going into chat. It illustrates a number of features shown here, A through G, that are elements that enhance habitat in a forest and can be either created or conserved in a way that still achieve fuel reduction goals. So the image on the left is shows their idea of a forest which has not seen fire for many years and has an unhealthy level of fuel density. The image on the right depicts a forest that's treated to reduce fire risk and be more resilient to insects and disease, to enhance wildlife habitat. This particular pattern, as it's drawn, it's a little bit phony looking, and in fact, it's an idea, it's a model, but it gives an idea of the elements that can provide habitat, such as snags, legacy trees, openings, and these other elements, and can be part of an effective fuel management program. Some folks are speaking of the benefit of SLOPS, SLLOPPS, which is just an acronym made from these various elements. So while you wait for the creation of a similar document for our local conditions, our local vegetation types, I encourage you to check out this offering that comes from Oregon and Washington. So in other words, it's okay to have a messy landscape, and a messy landscape, if we're still managing for ladder fuels, can be compatible with managing wildfire risks. Remember, we're outside of the defensible space zone now, so maintaining this habitat complexity is very important. All of the features shown here, these shrub clumps, the downed logs, the snags, provide critical habitat niches for birds, for amphibians, reptiles, insects, fungi, many other species. In our field workshops, and over the next 6 weeks or so, we'll be able to see some of these features and other features in the context of real forests and vegetation management projects. Disturbance is a key factor shaping species diversity. Disturbed systems are often colonized by what are known as R strategists. These are organisms that invest their resources in a large reproductive rate, as opposed to longer life and other strategies. When an invasive exotic plant is in the system and it's free of its competitors and the herbivores, tremendous imbalance can occur. So here you see two photos. In the larger photo here on the right, you see some sort of vegetation management project that left the soil bare, increasing the risk of soil erosion, eliminating wildlife habitat, and just asking for invasive fire-prone plant infestations. This photo, which is a separate one, but is overlaid on the first, shows French broom, a common exotic that you're likely familiar with, and fire-prone weed species often spread in this kind of disturbed environment. Removal of invasive species should be prioritized, both to reduce a very dangerous wildfire fuel, but also to increase habitat. Ecologists tell us that wildland diversity is often highest at intermediate levels of disturbance. So not where there's very little disturbance, nor where there is a tremendous amount of disturbance, but sort of there's a healthy balance kind of in the middle. And that's a good segue into a discussion of wildfire as a disturbance. As we've moved into the wildlands, fire suppression has become more and more important to protect our homes and our property. We also have other factors like climate change and some history of grazing that kind of changed the diversity of the understory in forests. Our efforts to protect or to say suppress fire have been very successful. It's become clear that fire suppression has caused forests to become more dense as the natural thinning caused by frequent low intensity fires has been reduced. These very dense forests are more prone to drought, to disease, insect outbreaks, and infrequent but very high intensity fire that can result in the loss of tree stands and even species replacement. So in our environment, forests are adapted and therefore resilient to the disturbance caused by high frequency but low intensity fires. In conclusion, well-managed landscapes provide a lot of ecosystem services, include fire resilience by breaking up continuity of vegetative fuels and reducing the risk of high-intensity fire, by creating shade and making other microclimate modifications. They enrich the soil and hold it in place. They clean and manage stormwater. They participate in sequestration of carbon and therefore have a positive climate impact, and they support biodiversity. In closing, I want to offer these suggestions. Let's be curious. It's very complex what we're trying to do, but it's also very fascinating. And we'll make mistakes, and that's okay. We'll keep learning together. About 90%, as I said earlier, of Sonoma County is privately owned. So we are the ones that can make these positive changes. So what's next? What is most immediately next is that Brock Dahlman, co-founder of Occidental Arts and Ecology Center, will speak about fire resiliency at landscape level experiences from Occidental Arts and Ecology Center. I also have here shown, again, the flyer for the 2 field workshops that are coming up over the next number of weeks, June 18 and July 9. Please sign up for those if you're interested. We'd love to see you. And then also there will be a follow-up email within the next couple of days. It will have some of the things that we've been sharing this evening, a list of the resources that we're referring to, a link to that recording on YouTube, and again, this registration information for these upcoming workshops. So with that, I will stop and turn the podium over to Brock Dahlman.
Wonderful. Thank you, John. That was perfect setup. And good evening, everyone. My name is Brock Dahlman, and I work at the Occidental Arts and Ecology Center. And I'm happy to be here with you all tonight. And I'm just going to pile on with all the kudos and recognitions that John started us off with tonight, and get right into this. And if folks don't know about Occidental Arts and Ecology Center, we're a small retreat center, organic farm, permaculture training facility, community organizing strategy center in just up the hill from the bustling metropolis of Occidental. And I did want to honor, starting off here, just recognizing that we are on the traditional homelands and striving to act as good guests with our friends and allies, the members of the Southern Pomo tribe, the Coast Miwok tribe, and the Kashaya Pomo peoples. And West County, just for what it's worth, I think many of us have a sense of that, but just having been involved very much in the watershed world, we've been generally thinking about that part of Sonoma County that's west of the Laguna de Santa Rosa, from the Marin County line and on up to the Mendocino County line, and more or less with the lower Russian River kind of being the center of that area. And again, in thinking about this beyond defensible space, that beyond the 100-foot, I think John clearly offered up that what we're not talking about is that home hardening, the 5-foot zone, the 30 or the 100-foot zone. We're really tonight speaking about the importance of that nexus of the level that's outside of that larger area. And that doesn't mean that some folks have wildland, if you will, right up against their house within that zone. And so take the idea of 100 feet as a general recommendation. It's not a hard, don't pull the tape measure out and specifically limit yourself to just that distance. But I did want to offer up the way I'm a biologist and a restoration ecologist and work at different scales on land management, land tending, and often want to start with the classic set of questions, which I would support you all in when you think about this in managing your home or properties. Obviously, the first one is, where are you? Meaning, say you're in West County, and which of the watersheds in West County are you in? Are you on a steep slope? Are you on a flat slope? Are you adjacent to a stream? Are you on a north slope that's cooler, a hot south slope, a west and east face? Those microclimates, those topographic orientations are really important relative to the vegetation and the behavior of fire. And then what are your goals as a landowner? Do you have fire goals? Do you have water quantity and quality goals, biodiversity goals, your safety goals, aesthetics goals, ideally goals for all of those things? Again, which type of vegetation do you have on your property? Is it forests? Is it redwoods? Is it Doug fir? Is it oak woodlands? Do you have chaparral? Do you have grasslands? Do you have wetlands? Do you have riparian? If you're lucky, do you have all of the above? That would be amazing. A lot of us often think about also the sort of the when are we question, which is really thinking about history and the past and past land uses and the state of succession of your land. Much of the lands that I'm familiar with in West County have a significant history, for instance, of having been logged, in some cases very early on. And then maybe there's second growth or third growth systems. They were firewooded, or there's other agricultural or rural residential or grazing histories in them. So when are you? And then the question of, based on where you are and what you have and what are your goals and such, how do we interact with vegetation in a regenerative way? And so we'll talk a little bit more about, do you cut it? Do you thin it? Do you burn it? Do you chip it? Do you biochar it? Do you mow it? Do you graze it? Do you leave it alone? Do you do a piece of all of the above? Is it a smorgasbord? And that's really what we're interested in, is the opportunity of your answer to those questions and how you choose to behave is really thinking about this idea that John mentioned about disturbance and really engaging in, are we degenerative disturbers or regenerative disturbers? Is the disturbance regime we're interacting with on the landscape for vegetation part of a regenerative relationship with that landscape? And then really who's doing the work and with what labor and with what money? And ideally we'll talk a little bit about the idea of whether you're doing that yourself or you're hiring that out, or is there public funds and cost share funds? Are we collaborating with these just workforce training and education programs? And the sum of all that is, it depends. And that's can be a really daunting piece of the puzzle for folks, of where do I start and how do I begin? And that's really what this series, between tonight's webinar, the 2 field days, and then the lightning consultations at the end, is trying to help us all engage in what admittedly is a very complicated relationship with land, especially in West Sonoma County, where it's intrinsically biodiverse. So I'll just offer up that we at OAC back in 2015, 2016, created this wildland stewardship plan, and that was done in consultation or collaboration with CAL FIRE and the Natural Resource Conservation Service. And so you can find this on our website. Hannah can probably put a link in the chat for you. And we've got a series of goals in there. We have soil goals and water goals and fire goals and life goals and education goals, economic goals, and they're all interrelated. That's the fun part about ecology, is it's really the study of relationships. And so we happen to have it at the OAC property, this 80-acre piece of land, just a half a mile up the hill from Occidental and Coleman Valley Road there. We do have significant coastal prairie, grassland habitat, as you can see in the map on the left side there. And then we also have what are called soft chaparral. That's coyote brush, poison oak, the native bramble, toyon, coffeeberry, things like that. And there's a whole bunch of species like that wren tit right in the middle of my photo there, that when we don't have chaparral, we don't have wren tit. That bird for us in West County is very tightly correlated with chaparral. So I often think about how I'm engaging with chaparral, and I keep wrentit in mind. How can I create conditions conducive for wrentit to be able to be happy there, to breed there, to feed there as an indicator species? Or the quail, for instance, is one for us, or plant biodiversity and wildflowers in our meadows, these other indicators. Grasslands and prairies and chaparral are very disturbance dependent ecosystems. And so we actively engage with them. There are times we're mowing our grassland. We have practiced prescribed burning in those prairies over the years. We do a lot of active seed collection and the spreading of seed and diversifying with other natives, other wildflowers, supporting all those insects that John talked about. One of the disturbance regimes that is something we often refer to as our Goldilocks grazing. So there's overgrazing, and then there's undergrazing, and then there's just the right in the middle type of grazing as a disturbance regime. And so we are currently collaborating with the Goldridge RCD and UC Cooperative Extension with funding through the county and Open Space and Ag and Open Space District to do a planned grazing or prescribed grazing process, not just on our own 80 acres, but the 2 80-acre parcels just to the west of us that you can see here. And in the purple polygons are the targeted areas where we are running animals, in this case 54 sheep from bodega pastures with 7 goats. And we've got a wonderful herding dog named Glenn and a really fun guard dog to keep the mountain lions and coyotes away named Matsutake. And we're bringing these animals in. We have electric fencing, we provide water, they're staying on site, and they're mowing and munching and compacting the grass in certain areas down, or incorporating the organic matter of the thatch into the soil. They're urinating. This group of sheep at 54 is dropping 200 pounds of manure every day wherever they're grazing, and the size of the paddock changes. And then we move them, and every day they're moving to fresh pasture. And so we're mimicking like as if it was a herd of bison or elk, or imagine in Africa how the wildebeest move across the Serengeti. That's biomimicry or ecological emulation. And then we also at OAC, and like much of West County, we have a lot of mixed evergreen hardwood forests where you've got your bay, madrone, various species of oaks, interior live oak, coast live oak, black oaks, white oaks, hazelnuts in there. And then we have our classic coniferous forest, which for us is primarily redwood and Douglas fir, and may also have some hardwoods in there, especially like tan oak is often blended in there as well. And again, we're looking for which of the species we are thinking about as indicators, whether that's a wonderful western tanager that nests in our oak woodlands, or the red tree vole, the Sonoma tree vole that lives in the Douglas firs, the band-tailed pigeons that are eating the madrone berries. How are we managing for those various states of ecological condition and function for the wildlife here, who are indicators of the health of the system upon which they're dependent? One of the species we explicitly manage for at OAC is the northern spotted owl, which is a federally and state threatened species. And we actually have them breeding on the property at OAC for the last 12 years, I believe. And in fact, I just took this photo in the beginning of the week. This is one of the parents, and we have, and I'm happy to say, 2 brand new fledgling spotted owls at OAC. We've had fledgling owls now every year except for in the middle of the drought 2 years ago at the property. And so we're actively tending and managing the vegetation at OAC in a second and third growth setting for a so-called old growth dependent species that's happily reproducing there. And they're the ones that keep us honest and are the judges upon which are we doing a good job with our work or not. The land that we have, like many of you all, may look like this, like it did for us. These are some photos from the early 2000s. We moved there in 1994 of a logged out forest that then was fire suppressed. And then you see, in this case, the Douglas fir encroachment in what many people refer to as a dog hair thicket, where there's many, many young stems that are invading into a hardwood forest or prairie or chaparral, and then they slowly shade that system out and take it over. And then they've got a lot of dead branches on there, what people often refer to as a fire ladder, those dead limbs that where the fire can climb up into the canopy, or they begin to shade out the other trees and convert that ecosystem over. And so while we love Douglas fir, it's an amazing native tree. It's we would not have red tree voles if we did not have Douglas fir, for instance, because they're a species that's wholly dependent on Doug fir. So it's not that we're out to get Doug fir, but that we're looking for a balance in the disturbance regime, in this case, say, with our relationship to Doug fir. So we have a mantra here that talks about fewer trees, but more forest. And so this is really about the quality of trees versus the quantity per se of trees, and really focusing on the older trees, the canopy closure of the trees, the space between the trees, that relationship of how it is that we're managing, not just for fire, but for the space, for air, for openness, for the ability of spotted owls to fly through this forest and hunt the wood rats that they want, whereas they can't do that so effectively in a very choked up forest. And so we're actively engaged in this system because we're healing a piece of land that has been significantly modified in the last 120 plus years with several rounds of clear cutting and over harvesting and firewooding. And so this is a lot like first aid and a bit of CPR to help recreate the conditions conducive for old growth again over time. And there is also, in this world of thinning, there's what some of us might think of as less trees and less forest. So not all thinning is created equally, and I wish to explicitly state that what we're talking about and doing, and for those of you who come to OAC to see this, you'll get to witness, I think, the sensitivity and the focus we have about that we're engaged in the forest as a verb while we're dealing with the trees as a noun. And I think many of us have become, unfortunately, a bit sensitized to the salvage logging that's been happening in our county post-fire. And this was an article in the Press Democrat about that after the Walbridge fire. And this is me speaking personally and not on behalf of the group of people bringing you this, but I would concur with the opinion of this, the concern around the level to which this industrial extraction post-fire is less than ecological. So again, here's a group of Marin Conservation Corps youth that we began by limbing and thinning and removing Douglas fir on behalf of this oak woodland that you can see here. And then in the next picture, if you pay attention to the oak clump there, we took all of that material and those limbs and those branches, and we laid them perpendicular to a dry stream channel that when it runs, we're now slowing the flow and spreading the flow and sinking the flow and retaining the sediment and increasing the water holding capacity of the landscape. So it's more fire resilient because the trees are healthier and less dried out, and using that waste product of fire and fuel load to become part of the carbon and water security of the system. And so here's another image that's not at OAC and a neighboring property up in Mendocino, where we thinned and limbed out Doug fir that were encroaching on black oaks, and we used that material in the images below to actually fill up a massive gully that was bleeding sediment directly into a salmon-bearing waterway. And then that's going to become a green gauze of a bandage that's staunching the bleeding of the gully and retaining the sediment in situ and composting in place and sequestering the carbon and holding the water and healing up that scar on the land over time with, again, the waste product of what is considered to be excessively flammable and invasive and invading in those oak woodlands. So for us, slash is not trash. It's actually a beneficial biomass if it's appropriately reutilized. So we think a lot about the reutilization of this amazing material that photosynthesis has created. And so all of that organic matter that we would like to restructure and reshape the architecture of these forests a little bit to be more fire resilient. Maybe we're going to make biochar out of that for a soil amendment. Maybe we're going to make a wildlife habitat brush pile. Sometimes we do just need to burn piles, and that's a process that is done appropriately. You may lop it and scatter it and distribute it on the forest floor at times. We sometimes contour, lop it, and lay it. So we lay it across the contour like speed bumps for contour carbon catchments. Again, another head cut gully stuffing project. There are times you need to chip it and haul it away because that's the appropriate call, or you chip it and mulch it and leave it on site as compost or mulch. And we also like to use these round poles oftentimes for construction, for timber framing, for pole barns. So again, really seeing the benefits of these incredible resources on the landscape. They're not waste. And we also have a lot of French broom and Scotch broom, these non-native species that are woody and tend to be invasive in our setting. And so we'll use that material. So our problem becomes a solution. And we're in this case showing how we're stuffing a gully here that otherwise is bleeding sediment directly into the Dutchbill Creek watershed, where we have coho salmon and steelhead trout who are spawning downstream of OAC's property. And so sediment is the #1 pollutant in our North Coast waterways, and one of the most significant impacts to the rearing and habitat for salmonids who make their nests, their reds, R-E-D-D, in the bed of the creek, in the gravel bed, and they lay their eggs and their babies are born there and they rear there. And if those gravels become full of sediment and plugged up, they suffocate those baby fish. And so having clean water and clean water leaving your land is really important. And so we have worked at OAC with the North Coast Regional Water Board, the Water Quality Control Board, and the California Department of Fish and Wildlife here recently, as of this last year, to obtain 2 specific permits that allow us to strategically, again, place this biomass, this beneficial biomass, into these head cut gullies. So at OAC, we don't have specific salmon rearing habitat on our property. We don't have perennial creeks on the property. All of our creeks are ephemeral. They're upland creeks. They're known as what are called Class 3 streams by the forestry community. So they're dry and they run when it rains, but otherwise they're dry, but they do directly connect to the river system, the creeks, and deliver sediment and other pollutants downstream. So we are placing ultimately, and on this map on the right, wherever the little yellow lines are or the red stars, we're strategically going to be utilizing this overgrowth of vegetation as a result from fire suppression, placing them in the gullies on behalf of the resilience of the system. So here's a gully we did, and I'll just play this little time lapse here. You can see the gully right in the foreground, just right of that stump. That stump would have been cut in the 1890s or 1900. And that gully is incised, it's calving sediment, it's head cutting and migrating up the channel. It delivers directly to Dutchbill Creek, any of that sediment. And so a group of us were out there and we were working on the hill slopes. We're limbing, we're thinning, we're doing this work. We're not changing the canopy closure of this forest overall. We're working the underbrush, and you can see people are bringing it down. We're adding the green material in, the green gauze, the fine filtered material, then some larger branches, some larger limbs, and then we're making like a big lasagna with the noodles as logs and branches, and then the sauces and the cheese of all of the branches and the needles of Douglas fir and redwood and such. And then the water will now come down that, and it will catch sediment and catch detritus and debris and swell up and store that carbon in that system and become a big carbon sponge where all the carbon is sequestered. And then the tree roots actually can grow back into that and restabilize it. And we can begin to re-elevate our channels and bring them up higher, which increases the water holding capacity of the landscape, as well as producing clean water downstream and hopefully storing more water like a sponge so it can leak later longer to support stream flows in the dry season. And John mentioned this wonderful guidebook and this idea of slops, the snags and the logs and the legacy openings and the patches and piles and the shrubs. And what we're really interested in is the heterogeneity, the diversity, the complexity, the mixed upness of it. So it's sloppy, if you will. We're really creating strategic messes, and life loves a good mess. And that's what we're striving to mimic or ecologically emulate. Again, our wonderful spotted owls. And while this photo isn't from a week ago, I did get to see our 2 brand new baby fledgling owls, northern spotted owls at OAC. So we're very happy to see them again and taking that as a positive sign or affirmation of the work. One of the things about spotted owls for us is that their main prey is the native dusky-footed wood rat. So a lot of the work we do is with that. If we're not stuffing a gully, then we're going to strategically, in places where it's safe to do so, we're going to make a pile that is going to ideally become a habitat and a home for a group of dusky-footed wood rats. So we're making rat habitat, because if you don't have enough rats, you can't feed owl babies. And so on behalf of the carrying capacity for spotted owls, we're having an integrated relationship by creating the conditions conducive for wood rats as part of our food for spotted owls. I'm a herpetologist by birth and training, and I love our native salamanders. And we have 4 species of salamanders that breed in a terrestrial setting. They don't go to the water to breed, and they live in the leaf litter and the duff. And so we're very sensitive to minimizing the disturbance of the duff. And our practice is we don't mechanically masticate our forest and do that work. We're doing hand work. We're doing limbing and thinning with hand tools and some chainsaws on occasion. If we're chipping, that chipper stays up on the road. And that's really because we're sensitive to the biodiversity of the mycelial network and all of these other critters, whether they're small vertebrates like salamanders or they're invertebrates, such as these wonderful California turret spiders, these amazing endemic spiders to California that live in these burrows. And that female turret spider, she can live in her little silken burrow for up to 15 years. Imagine that. And they're very sensitive. And when I'm in forests that are being tended sensitively, I see more turret spiders than when they're being much more systematically ground disturbed and maybe turned to bare dirt and such. And then we have used controlled fire at OAC, and fire is absolutely a tool, an important tool, and we've done controlled burning since the late 90s. And in fact, this last year, in collaboration with Fire Forward and the CAL FIRE chiefs in the area, we did a prescribed burn on 4 acres. That was a component of a limbing and thinning strategy for hardwood evergreen forest restoration. And we were using fire to more rapidly convert some of that biomass over into potash and part of the nutrient cycle and making space. And then we're going to go back in and do some revegetation, ideally with some other hardwoods in there. We've done a lot of this work with support and funding, and we've been a part of the North Bay Forest Improvement Program, thanks to Prop 68 money through CAL FIRE and with Goldridge RCD and after the fire, and just finished a 41-acre project with them. And this fall, we're going to start doing more of that work with the Natural Resource Conservation Service. And we're going to be also doing work with them where we're actually going to get funded to create these snags, those standing dead trees. And we're going to be doing more wood rat nest piles as well as fuel load limbing and thinning. And we are always open as an education facility to collaborate with groups of people. So we have a long history with Santa Rosa Junior College students who've come out there to learn and work with us and do a lot of this work, or Conservation Corps North Bay or circuit riders. And then we have a recent effort in collaboration with the North Bay Jobs with Justice and a partnership with a number of their worker leaders around basically trying to create a worker justice framework where we honor labor and we honor communities coming together in a training, in this case with farm workers and immigrant communities as well around this effort. And so I think that's something that, just like a forest in the ecosystem, we also want a diverse ecosystem and the connectivity in the ecosystem of how all of us can be keystones in this process together. And so if you want to come out and have a look at that, by all means, come out and see us after you sign up for the Schoen Farm Tour on June 18th. Come out July 9th to OAC and check us out. And with that, I'm going to just end the show, and I'll give it back over to the group here. So there you have it.
Wonderful. Thank you, Brock. So let me get my screen up for you guys. So for those of you who haven't met me yet, I'm Brianna Boaz. I'm the Natural Resources Professor at Santa Rosa Junior College. And I'm also the program coordinator for our new Wildfire Resilience program, which I'll tell you a little bit about. So in my 2 years at the JC, I realized not a lot of people know what Schoen Farm is. And it is a hidden gem. We're out in West County, right off of River Road. And it's really our learning laboratory for the Agriculture and Natural Resources Department. We're right off of East Side Road, and altogether we've got about 360 acres. A lot of it is vineyard. We also have pastures and riparian areas, classrooms, and the part I care about, the forest. We've got a 120-acre forest that is very typical of West County in that it has not been managed very well, and it has a legacy of logging. It is a mixed evergreen forest dominated by bay laurels and Douglas firs, but there are some pockets of riparian habitat as well as oak woodland that we're trying to restore. Through our new Wildfire Resilience program, which started up last summer, it's 3 of the programs in the department have come together under this umbrella to tackle wildfire resilience from these different angles. We have prescribed grazing that we now have goats, as well as cattle and sheep. For natural resources, my program, we are doing vegetation management, both pre and post fire, as well as restoration. And then in collaboration with the horticulture program, we're doing fire resilient landscaping. And underneath this WRP umbrella, there's a lot of cross collaboration. So for example, we're preparing part of the forest now that we're trying to do some oak savanna restoration. We're prepping it to have goats and sheep. And we're also working with the horticulture department where we're collecting and propagating native species of bunch grasses and other perennials in the greenhouses as well. So I'll tell you guys about the Wildfire Resilience program through the Natural Resources program. Our real focus is education as well as workforce development, that this is work that needs to be done, and we've got a lot of people that want to do this work. Pretty much every single person in this county has been directly or indirectly impacted by wildfire, particularly a lot of my students that are coming from a lower socioeconomic background. And it's been really empowering to give them these skills for chainsaws and brush cutters and burn piles and other vegetation management protocols, to equip them with that knowledge so that they can go out and do this work so that these devastating wildfires won't continue in Sonoma County. Here is a list of our intern cohorts. We've had a whole gaggle of interns every semester starting from last summer. Originally, we started in the forest prepping the first 30-acre chunk of our total 120 acres for a planned prescribed burn that we hope to put on the ground by the end of the year. But the program was so popular, we added a second internship underneath the WRP umbrella, focusing on restoration, because we realized with a lot of the disturbance we were instigating in the forest, we had a lot of invasive species coming up, particularly French and Scotch broom, which come up a lot after a burn pile or other kind of disturbance. So our restoration internship, we're working with Point Blue Conservation Science to do native species propagation, planting, and monitoring. And it really does take a village to raise an intern. We work with a lot of wonderful partners, such as Fire Forward, that we're working with 2 of their newly certified burn bosses to do this kind of work and training for our students. And they've gone on, and our first cohort of interns has already started getting jobs in the field. So at Laguna de Santa Rosa Foundation, Pepperwood, Cadia Forestry, which does a lot of the contracting work for PG&E, doing utility line clearance. And as of this morning, one of our students just got a job at Sonoma Ecology Center. So way to go, Darby. The reason we're doing this work is because here in West County, it has not burned in a long time. And as John and Brock have mentioned before, a lot of these are fire-dependent ecosystems. And with fire suppression, we have not seen anything good happen to our forests. Health concerns like sudden oak death, abundance of fuel leading to these really catastrophic fires that we've seen time and time again since 2017. And it really was a blessing in disguise, because I think it opened a lot of people's eyes to the importance of this work, why it needs to be done, and why we need to educate and develop a workforce to go out there and do this kind of work. And no one asks me why we're trying to do a prescribed burn. They just ask me when we're doing it now. So that's been a really positive movement in Sonoma County. So for our first 30 acres, which is what our tour on June 18th will be, here in our first 30 acres, we're really doing a lot of our burn unit prep, constructing shaded fuel breaks, doing limbing and thinning and pruning, hundreds of burn piles, hundreds, some of which we went so long without burning them, they've become habitat, and we're letting them stay habitat. We've also been doing broadcast burns, as well as a lot of monitoring, which we're really going to ramp up those efforts this summer, teaching students about plant identification, native versus invasive species, and then tracking how our vegetation management practices impacting the community over time. We're also doing a lot of native plant propagation and invasive species management as well. So a lot of trainable, good professional development skills for students so they can go out and do this work in the field. Pretty picture time. This is what the forest looked like last summer. We called this place Toxico Dungeon because it had so much poison oak, we could barely see the fence line that we share with Gallo Vineyards next door. Also, the importance of communicating with neighbors. Can't overstate that. Luckily, Gallo has been very amenable to our vegetation management efforts, and they've been a great partner in this effort. So starting off, we had our first cohort of interns that we trained them with brush cutters, chainsaws, and other equipment, how to safely use and maintain that equipment. And we really started hitting the fence lines hard so we could create that control line, that fuel break. So when we do put fire on the ground, it can be as controlled as possible. So chugging away at Toxico Dungeon, luckily some of our interns do not have poison oak reactions, and those are the ones out there now. And over time, we really began to clear out this incredibly dense, overstocked, unhealthy forest. And this spring, we started putting fire back on the ground after we had done so much of that vegetation management and fuel reduction, using drip torches and broadcast burns to reintroduce good fire. Here, this is one of our ridges that our burn unit is between Ridge 0, a ridge that we didn't know existed before we started doing the work because that's how dense the vegetation was. And then Ridge 1 is our other fire control line. And this is what one of the ridges looked like, just a lot of dead, downed, woody material, as well as dead branches that can act as a fuel ladder. And once the fire gets up into the canopy, it's killing the trees, it's easy to spread by wind, it's a major concern. Over time, we began to thin out those dead trees, build burn piles, and then light them on fire, which the interns have really enjoyed. We are creating the next generation of pyromaniacs, scientifically informed pyromaniacs. So using drip torches. Here, this is our Ridge 0 that we didn't know existed. We've called it Manzanita Mountain because it's actually a wonderful hidden treasure trove of biological diversity in manzanitas. Before we started managing it, it was incredibly dense, thick, major fire risk. Over time, we began to thin it out, burn pile it, burn it, and now it's a beautiful, lush, common manzanita grove. And we've seen a ton of native understory species begin to return as well, now that they're finally getting light. Student monitoring is one of my main focuses in the natural resources and the Wildfire Resilience program of how can we track the changes over time to see what worked and what might need improvement. And in just the 1 year we've been doing this program, we've seen an immense explosion of native biodiversity, which has been so wonderful to see and to have students trained to do that monitoring and recognize this native biodiversity. So we've seen fritillarias and hound's tongues and Dutchman's pipevine. The pipevine swallowtail population, the butterflies, have really grown in just 1 year of opening up the canopy and creating some light. One of our goals and part of our first burn unit is oak woodland restoration, that historically our forest was probably a black oak woodland, so higher up on ridges, drier, but a really important native species for wildlife and indigenous peoples. But with poor management over the last 100+ years, we've got a lot of Douglas fir encroachment, and we've been clearing out some of the non-native species, thinning out the Douglas firs, bringing back good fire, and encouraging oak woodlands. Over this summer, we'll also be introducing grazing to knock back some of the non-native grasses, which are unfortunately in abundance, to further increase the oak woodland diversity. Some of our future directions, because I hope to offer this internship program to my students for the rest of my life, because wildfire is always going to be a concern in Sonoma County. Restoration is a really big one. That what do you do with a 1 million acre fire print scar, like with the Caldor or the Dixie fire? How can we feasibly restore some of these ecosystems? Also looking at invasive species management, that after the burn piles, tons and tons of French broom have come up, which is expected because ecologically there's a big flush of the seed bank after that kind of a disturbance. So how can we manage for those invasive species, encourage native species growth, as well as monitor and track it over time? Another thing that we've begun is biochar. We have 2 kilns, which on top of making biochar, also great for hot dogs. And since most of Schoen Farm is a farm, we're hoping to make biochar on site so that we can put that into our sustainable agriculture fields, into our hemp production program, and into our 100 acres of vineyard. We're producing a ton of woody material, but it doesn't all have to go to waste. And for carbon sequestration is really on the forefront of a lot of people's minds, climate change. So instead of burn piling everything and releasing that carbon into the atmosphere, how can we actually trap it in the soil for long-term storage? So these are some of the future directions we're going for. If you'd like to learn more, you can register for the Schoen Farm Field Workshop on June 18th. We'll be meeting out at the farm and we'll mosey around the forest so we can see how do you manage these different ecosystems with a varying history with all of these different management techniques, both mechanical with chainsaws and brush cutters, fire, and the combination of the two. We've got different units for all of those. So I hope to see some of you guys on June 18th. Let me stop sharing my screen now.
So, hi, Ellie here. We have another speaker, Mike Jones, who is going to be stepping in for Sashi Sabaratnam. And he is actually in the middle of a wildfire training right now. So we have a message out to him to come on in. And in the meantime, you know, I've been monitoring the Q&A, but there actually aren't any questions. So I encourage you all that while we're waiting for Mike to throw some questions in the Q&A so that we can get to you here. And I just want to thank everybody so far for providing just a fascinating roundup of information. Brianna, and I think that everyone is complementing each other beautifully. I wonder, actually, Brianna, I'll ask a question right now. What is your strategy to date, or what are you thinking you'll do about that broom as it's coming back? What are some of the tips you could give us?
Yes, so we're doing a combination of mechanical removal as well as repeated burning. In the burn pile areas where the French broom is first coming up, we've got a 3-year window before the French broom starts setting seed. And by that point, the management really gets out of control. So in those fresh sprouts, we're hitting those mechanically, a lot of hand pulling. In the areas where the French broom is to reproductive maturity, it's producing seeds and hundreds of seeds per plant. Those we're introducing fire to knock them down, because if you just cut them at the base, they'll resprout quite readily, like a lot of species out in West County. So with those, we're burning them and then mechanically hand pulling the seedlings so we can deplete the seed bank. And then once we've cleared the area, put in some of our perennial grasses like Elymus glaucus, wild blue rye, some juncus, and some other species that we've collected seeds on site, grown them in the greenhouse. We put them back in these areas that we've managed for French broom, and then we'll track it over time and remove the French broom as needed. But it's like a hydra. You cut off one head and there's 10 more.
Yeah. I've also heard that when you mow it, you actually, it not only does it sprout more above, but it throws down roots deeper. And broom is actually one of the easiest things to pull if you haven't inspired it to grow deep roots. So it's better to, I think, to pull. And I also have heard it depends on the time of year, that you could actually mow it in the late summer when anything that's trying to do it's just not wet enough, and it actually can expire. So let's see.
I'm happy. Can I chime in on the broom game, having been pulling broom for 40 years now? I would say at OAC, we had acres and acres of it, and everything that Brianna just brought up. Again, as an ecologist, if you don't want a species, the question is, instead of creating conditions conducive for that species, you're going to create conditions that are not conducive for it. And so additionally, what we find is if the soil is wet, it's a whole lot easier to pull. So if we've had a winter and it's spring and we don't have seed, that's great. But as you pull it, you loft open that soil, and you've created, nature abhors a vacuum. You've created a seed bank. And as Brianna said, the broom seedlings will come up. They'll look like alfalfa sprouts. And that's where, if we can't get a controlled fire per se, we'll have a propane torch, and we'll use fire, but in a controlled way. And a propane torch with one of those flamers that you can buy, that's a really great way to flame off those seedlings, and then do what Brianna said, add the plants in you want. What we've also found, though, is if we end up cutting the plant when it's in the dry season, it's most stressed, French and Scotch behave a little differently, but it will crown sprout and sucker. So, but if we do it at the end of the year, half of them don't because they're so stressed out. And the half that do, once it's safe again and raining, we come by with the propane torch and we flame those. And we get almost 100% kill with no pulling and no soil disturbance. So there's less seedlings. And then again, we have to replace. So there's lots of ways for you at different scales to engage with the broom. And then somebody should just make brooms, because that's why it was brought here. And it makes an incredible broom, actually.
And everything that Brianna and Brock just mentioned, we will include in our handbook of best principles and practices, which will hopefully be out in at least, we'll have a draft of it hopefully in a year. But you heard it first here. Don't forget. Okay, a couple of more questions. What's the most ecological way to deal with poison oak?
Goats. If you've got goats that have been trained to eat poison oak and they don't have a lot of other options in their paddock, we're using electric fencing, so temporary fencing for the goats. That's been very successful because in some of our areas, poison oak is the dominant understory species. And while it is important for birds, the berries provide an important food source. Having 100% poison oak, 100% of anything is not desirable ecologically. So we've been doing goat grazing for it.
I'll shine some. Poison oak is this amazing plant, and it can be just little bitty sprouts at the forest floor. It can be the big shrubs that are in the chaparral that are so thick you can't get through. And then folks may have noticed it also is a vine. And in our forest and in the old growth forest, there's these incredible poison oak vines. And in both instances, in the forest where we have poison oak vines, where there's not leaves down low and unless you snuggle that vine, you're not going to get it. Our practice is to leave all poison oak vines going up into the conifers, because the 2 spotted owl nests that we've had for the last 12 years are both in third growth, either a redwood or a Doug fir, that are small diameter trees, but they have big poison oak vines. And when the poison oak hits the sun at about 100 feet up, in their case, it branches out, and that creates the platform for the spotted owls to put the nest on. So we have spotted owls nesting in third growth cutover forest in young trees in a combination where there's a poison oak umbrella substrate to make the nest on. So it's this, like everything, there's this dance to, you manage it where you don't, and you love it where you can leave it, and it's an equilibrium game.
Cool. Let's see. Wow, I'm really glad we're having that conversation about poison oak, because a lot of people wonder about, just wanting to get rid of it entirely. So it does have its importance. Now I'm going to go to the question and answer, because that's where we've asked you to put things. I know a lot of you are putting it in the chat, but if you could move it over to the Q&A, just rewrite it or copy and paste from there. Here's one from V. Tominia. Aside from the upcoming field tours, are there workshops for hands-on experience for these vegetation management strategies in West County? And are there opportunities for citizen scientists to volunteer at OAC or Schoen Farm for plant mapping and monitoring?
Yes. A lot of Schoen Farm, especially the hands-on vegetation management training right now, is through our classes and through our Wildfire Resilience program internship. But we're hoping to do a landowner vegetation management workshop out at Schoen, training people how to do some of this equipment and do some of this management for themselves, as well as set them up with contacts and contractors in the county that can go to your back 40 and do it for you. So stay tuned for that. The second part of the question is a lot easier because you don't have to enroll in anything. That we do have volunteer days, especially for mapping, monitoring, and invasive species removal out at the farm. And I'm happy to post those materials to the workshop attendees on the dates that we have volunteer opportunities. So it's very easy to get plugged into those.
Okay. Yeah, I'd like to come. There are more questions that are coming up, and I just got a message from Mike Jones that he's on deck. So why don't we turn it over to Mike and keep putting your questions in, and then we'll get back to them.
Hi, folks. Thanks for having me tonight. My name is Michael Jones. I am the UC Cooperative Extension Forest Advisor for Mendocino Lake and Sonoma counties. And I apologize for my tardiness. I'm also pinch hitting for my colleague Sashi, who this is really kind of her presentation. So I'm going to do my best and then add my own little bit at the end. But John, do you have the slides that she gave you? Is there any way you can share those so I can kind of talk from those?
Yes, Mike, just give me a second.
Sure, thanks. So I'm going to just kind of briefly talk about I can introduce the idea of cooperative extension and then specifically the projects that Sashi and our county director, Stephanie Larson, who's the range advisor, have been working on for Sonoma County. And then another kind of program, a forest stewardship workshop series that we host statewide that we're bringing back in the area. So I'll wrap it up with that conversation. And Sashi's listening, so now the pressure's on. But so what Sashi and Stephanie have been working on are just a suite of really great and powerful tools to help landowners at every stage of the process, really thinking about, when you're just getting to the point you're ready to do management, what the resources are needed to actually think about that process. Once you're starting management, to help your resource professionals and the contractors you're working with, help them get more familiar with your property, and to kind of help you assess your strategic steps, as you'll see in the notes that Sasha put together, of kind of thinking about how we go about resource management and stewardship. So first of all, I just want to mention that UC Cooperative Extension is essentially the front door to the UC system, the UC CSU system. And really what we are is we're a place where all that great research comes out of the UC system, and we repackage it into a content in a format and through workshops and handouts and online material into a format that's usable for the landowner and helps kind of help them understand how that research applies to their stewardship and their management. And so we have on our websites and within our resources and our libraries, we have just an incredible amount of information and resources available to help people who are thinking about natural resource management, forest stewardship. Of course, a lot of us are farm advisors. So we think about livestock and range and grazing and all the other types of producers that are there. So we have a really large amount of information to help folks who are thinking about managing for different commodities and resources. But we're going to specifically talk about the projects that we're offering in the Sonoma County and kind of the North County area. So on this slide are some of the programs that we'll be talking about. Match.Graze isn't a slide, but it's a really cool program. I heard goats come up and people are really interested about grazing. My colleague Stephanie, who is the range advisor, thought that this was a kind of a fun, cheeky name, Match.Graze. Basically, the idea is it's a map or an online platform that allows contract grazers to point out where they are located, what kind of resources they have, what kind of infrastructure they need to work with you. But also landowners who are interested in grazing can put themselves on the map. And so that, you can make those connections, right? So if a contract grazer is located near you, now you know where they are, they know you're there, and you can set up those relationships to start doing that contract grazing. Make sure you get mountain, not mountain goats in the sense, but goats that were raised up in the mountains who like poison oak and like to eat shrubs and stuff like that. Because if you get flatland goats, they're going to be used to grasses and probably not as good at eating poison oak. So it helps you kind of think about those things when you're planning for that kind of grazing. Next slide, please. And I'll mention that the vegetation management division that is on that slide that's really Sashi. That's her driving this process. And so she's doing really amazing stuff with UC and with the local community. So the whole point of this program is to help private landowners and public land managers plan for vegetation management. So you see kind of the breakdown. The idea is, we're really what our role is we help you with the information and the resources to help you achieve your goals and objectives, right? So we don't come to you and say, here's what you need to do. We say, what do you want to do? And we give you the information to help you make those decisions. And part of that is if you're thinking about starting to do vegetation management and it's not something you've done before, you need to understand your property and the resources and kind of the landscape that you live in and a lot of the aspects that come into play that help you make the decision about where poison oak is a good thing or where something you don't want it. So we can just help you think about what you're doing and why you're doing it. And then, right, the part of this process is this is a really important aspect of vegetation management. It's not a one and done type of thing, right? We're not just going in, I'm sure you all talked about this. We're not just going in doing like an understory thinning or some veg management of some type, and then we walk away and we're done. That's just the first step. And now we have to think about what are your long-term strategic goals and plans for maintaining that work that you've done. And hopefully, as you continue to do that work and you're using all the tools in your toolbox, the effort that goes into it is reduced through time, right? So maybe that first entry of resource management is really extensive and costs a lot of money or it's a lot of effort, but hopefully each entry after that, which will be required for maintenance, gets easier and easier, and eventually it's just a part of a natural stewardship process. So we'll help you kind of think about how that plays out long-term, your short and long-term goals. And then most importantly, right, this is expensive. I'm sure you all know, those who've done it, who are thinking about it, resource management, vegetation management, forest management, it's very expensive. These are, particularly in Sonoma County, these contractors and the resources that are available to us can be very expensive. And so one thing that we help you do is not only connect you with those technical resources, which I'll talk more about later, but also about those financial options. So we have grant potential, like big, large grants that CAL FIRE and other organizations and agencies offer, as well as some small cost share incentive programs that I'll talk about a little bit later that can help you kind of implement some of these management practices. Next. So one of the first tools that Stephanie kind of worked on and Sashi helped tie up on the end is called the Wildfire Fuel Mapper. And this is a really cool kind of online web tool. Anybody who's done resource management or is thinking about it knows that maps are really important, right? We have to think about maps. Maps help us plan. They help a contractor or resource professional or somebody who's coming to our land to help with consultation or implement management practices. They need maps. We have to understand, right? We're going back to understanding what our property is, the resources we have available, and why we're managing and how we're managing. And so what Wildfire Fuel Mapper tool did was it took, basically, there's already a huge amount of map data available online, a lot of different layers of information through GIS and has been developed for Sonoma County that CAL FIRE has developed statewide. And basically what Wildfire Fuel Mapper did is at the parcel level, it basically compiled all of these different maps that are available and created a package that the landowner was able to then look at this kind of catalog of map information. So vegetation type, what is your slope, what is your fire risk, all these different really important maps that help you start thinking about your resource management. So a really great tool. You can search it online and you can look up your parcel. And a really important first step in working with those professionals, right? Like I said, they're going to come to your property, and first thing they're going to want to know is, you know, your property really well because you walk it all the time or you're always doing work on it, but they're not going to know. And this is a really good way to kind of introduce them to what your property is and your kind of goals and objectives. Next slide, please. So this is the next step. I guess not next step, but like a next stage of the wildfire fuel mapper, the Wildfire Resilience Planner. This is in testing stage. So if you want to be a beta tester for this, you can email that to Sashi there. Her contact info is right there. I'm not as familiar with this program, but what I'll say is, from my understanding and how I've interacted with, and talked with Stephanie and Sashi, is this is like basically an interactive version of the Wildfire Fuel Mapper. Those are static maps that you just kind of pull the existing information from the internet. It gives you this package of information. This tool now, we're thinking at a larger scale, so not just at the parcel level, but at maybe even the county level. We're thinking about all the different factors that interact that might help us think about creating a management plan or approaching vegetation management or forest stewardship, whatever how you want to frame it. But it creates all these layers and these tools that come together that you can manipulate to kind of understand better what you're trying to tease out as far as your goals and objectives. And so they're testing it right now. I highly recommend, if you're interested in these kinds of maps and you're a nerd map like me and you like playing around with these kinds of things, then I suggest you check it out. I don't have a lot to say on that. I wish I knew more about it, but it certainly is an amazing tool that if you can kind of select which treatments you want to do and identify the areas that you want to treat, that's a really powerful tool that will help in the future planning implementation, moving forward and working with professionals. Next slide, please. In my personal opinion, and hopefully a lot of people who think about this stuff, one of the most important things that you can do in the beginning stages of this work of doing resource management, whether it's for wildfire, forest health, wildlife, is to develop a management plan. And it really helps you tease out and identify your goals and objectives, both short and long term. It helps you identify your history of your site, what existing resources you have, your infrastructure, and helps you establish that kind of baseline that you want to move forward from. And I think this is just a really powerful tool. We call them forest management plans because I work in forestry, but really these kinds of plans can be developed for your entire property across multiple habitat types, which is really valuable. But we have a really cool program within UC A&R, Ag and Natural Resources, which is the kind of parent of UC Cooperative Extension. And it's called the Forest Stewardship Workshop Series. And basically the idea is that we help we take landowners and we work through, we have a Forest Stewardship Workshop Series, which is about a 25-part series of documents. They're very short and easy to digest, that covers every single aspect of forestry and natural resource management in California, starting with definitions, right? What is a FMP, a forest management plan, or what is an RPF, registered professional forester? And we work through all those, all the way down to like financial, tax, and legacy planning. And so it's a really great series. And so we built this workshop around it to help landowners kind of understand what it means to do forest and natural resource management, and what kind of what the process is, what a forester who you will need to have an official forest management plan. It's called a California Cooperative Forest Management Plan. To have it officially signed off, you'll need to work with a consulting professional forester, but really understands their process, what they're thinking, how they're going about developing the plan. It helps you understand some of the elements that you can do on your own. And then lastly, we provide a stipend through the workshop so that you can set up that first site visit with the resource professional to help you move forward in your process of developing the plan, or even starting to do implementation. So it's a really neat program. We hold them all over the state. We had the first one was in Ukiah. We did one in Santa Rosa last summer. We're doing one in Lake County this summer. And then we'll have next spring, we're having one in Napa County. And I think this is a really great program. And it's not just about, we really want you to work with a forester. I think it's a very important thing. They're very experienced and knowledgeable folks who can help you think about some of these things that you're probably already thinking about, and help you outline these goals and objectives. But we're also helping you connect with other resource professionals, like if you're interested in prescribed fire or other types of management, we're going to try to help you get those connections as well. And then most importantly, I think we also connect you and help you understand the cost share incentive program. So I'll take the opportunity to really talk about that financial assistance right now. What we have, to be honest, there isn't a ton of money and resources available to help private landowners do natural resource management, forest management. But there are, in Sonoma County, we're very fortunate. We have 3 cost share incentive programs. And basically what that means is they're not a full grant. They cover a portion of implementation, is a schedule. It depends on a lot of different factors. But the idea is that it's an incentives program because the agencies that host these programs are encouraging you to do the resource management by paying you back some of the expenses it costs. So the first one that we have that's a really great program is through Natural Resources Conservation Service. That's the EQIP, or Environmental Quality Incentives Program. Really, really cool program. Very versatile, not just for forest health improvement, but they do road work. Since it's NRCS, which is through USDA, they do agricultural work. They can do fences and roads and all kinds of stuff. Great program. Highly recommend that a lot of people check it out. They can also help you write forest management plans by providing some of that cost share. The other one is through CAL FIRE. It's the CFIP, California Forest Improvement Program. Same idea, very much focused on improving forest stand structure. So improving forest health, understory thinning, reducing forest density, improving forest health, and all those good things that we're thinking about when we think about long-term sustainable and resilient forest structure. And then unique to our region, in particular, Sonoma County, is the North Bay Forest Improvement Program. This is managed through the Resource Conservation Districts, so the RCDs, with support from, I forget what Rebuild North Bay is called now. I apologize, but it's a collaborative effort, and it's hosted in Sonoma, Napa, Lake, and Mendocino counties. And so that's the cost share program that's just unique to our area. But we have 3 really great tools that help you achieve some of the goals and objectives you're looking for. And so I highly recommend you take advantage of those programs. You're going to want to reach out to the Resource Conservation District, particularly for Sonoma County. That's Jason Wells. He's the forester for the Sonoma RCD. And then our RCD forester is Joe. I forget Joe's last name. I apologize. I'm winging this right now. But if you just go to the NRCS website, he will, that information is there. So the last thing that I'll mention, that's financial resources. These are really great tools that we have available. If you want to think larger and do collaborative grants, CAL FIRE is a great resource. CAL FIRE Forest Health Grants, you can get big dollars, big monies to think about watershed level stewardship, collaborative efforts working across landowners. These organizations provide technical service. So the Resource Conservation District, the RCD, NRCS, UC Extension, CAL FIRE, we also provide site visits and technical services to help you think about your long-term goals and objectives and get you moving forward in that process. And so these are very valuable partners in this process that if you're thinking about developing fully developing a California Cooperative Forest Management Plan, you're going to have to work with a forester at some point. It's required for signing off that final plan. If you're going to go after the cost share incentives program, you have to have a forest management plan in place, which means you got to have one either through the incentives program, you build one and write one, or you come to the table with one already in place. So there are, some issues, or not issues, but I'd say that there is a process involved that you have to follow to really qualify for these incentive programs. They're competitive, so you have to actually apply and get selected for a cycle. But just because if you don't make one cycle doesn't mean you're done. You can just apply and get more later. And then lastly, I don't want to spend too much time on this, but it's also, this is vegetation management. We're doing resource management. So as a private landowner on your own property, as long as you're not impacting the public good, which is water and soil, there are very few restrictions and regulations on what you do with the vegetation on your forest, right? You can cut down trees, you can manage vegetation. If you want to pile burn, you need air quality permits, but there's nothing really saying that you can't do that stuff. Where you have to then think about regulatory processes and CEQA, for example, or some of the kind of permitting structures when you go after funding. So if you get these incentive programs, or if you get a CAL FIRE grant, anytime you do any kind of disturbance activity, whether it's soil or burning or removing vegetation where it involves manipulation of the natural resources, it triggers CEQA, which means you're going to have to go through this environmental review process. So keep that in mind. Plan for that. If you're going to go after big monies and you want to get some grant funding, you're going to have to factor in that you're going to need to do the CEQA process and a lot of that planning involved in that. Whereas if you're doing it on your own as a private landowner, there's a lot you can do that, as long as you're being a good steward and following best management practices, don't require the same rigorous review process. A lot of this information is on our extension websites. I have this compiled on the resources page on the UCCE Mendocino website. So if you type into the search bar UCCE Mendocino Forest Resources, a lot of this information is compiled there, and hopefully is very helpful. Is there anything else that you all wanted me to cover? I think I tried to run through it real quick and not take up too much time.
Thanks, Mike. We do have a Q&A. I'm not seeing questions come up specifically. Wait a minute, hold on. Well, there is a question, and I know I'm jumping the line, Tom Conlon, we'll get back to your question, but for Mike, are there any plans / funding to update the wildfire fuel mapper Lidar data, which goes back to 2013, and there's been many changes, especially in the Upper Mark West, where Lynn Garrick is, since the fires of 2017 and 2020.
Yeah, so they do small updates to that data set, and there is conversations about flying again, and CAL FIRE is actually having conversations about flying the entire state. So there is a lot of interest in figuring out how to keep those data up to date. I will say that you even have at Sonoma, I don't mean you, the editorial you, the us, Sonoma County, that we even have as robust of a Lidar data set and vegetation map is extremely unique to California. So I think that it's important to remember that the tools we already have available to us are incredibly powerful and way more than most counties have. And so let's use what we have. And if more stuff comes out, that's great. Mapping is a really important tool, but it only gets you so far. You still need boots on the ground. You still need to have eyes in the forest. Your forester is still going to want to cruise and assess what your forest structure is, what your habitat types are, what your tree density is. And so we want really accurate mapping.
Sorry to interrupt. Yeah. Oh, I know that Lynn is very active in the Upper Mark West Watershed Council, and they have they've been very, very active. They were completely devastated twice in the tubs, and then so I think that. But for those who aren't aware of the fuel mapper, what we're talking about with Lidar, well, the Lidar map was, of course, I'm not an expert in this, but they flew a series of airplane flights to map the vegetation, and Lidar is I'm going to let you fill in, Mike.
Sure.
Not too much detail because we've skipped over a couple of other questions.
Yeah. So in brief, Lidar stands for light detecting and range, and basically what they do is they shoot a bunch of laser pulses at the ground and then measure, and they reflect back into a receiver in the plane or the satellite or drone now, and they measure the time it takes for that pulse to get back, and then they can determine elevation, so height. And so what they can build is they call it digital elevation maps or different types of vegetation maps, where they can actually map out the height structure of the vegetation. So you can really infer a lot of information. If you have a lot of tall, cylindrical kind of shaped objects, you're like, well, that's probably conifers. Or if you have a lot of low structure vegetation, like maybe that shrub, coyote brush, and then you can see how you can kind of develop these different in combination with other types of data, these kind of really accurate vegetation models and kind of structure models from this data. It's crazy cool.
Excuse me, I'm going to interrupt again. No, the good news that in the chat, Kim Batchelder has said that Ag and Open Space has received funding from NASA with North Coast Resource Partnership to do a flyover of Lidar data in the coming year. So that's great. Cool. But let me get to a couple of other questions. And by the way, everyone else in the panel is muted, but if you guys want to speak up, feel free. I just want to turn to Lynn a while back. Well, let me go to Tom Conlon's question. In any of these forest vegetation removal experiments, have you calculated the net effect on the carbon stock? How long does it take for the removal of carbon to first equalize and then become a net positive carbon sink? And Brock, you might want to address this in sort of a general way or specific.
Okay. We OAC have not done any formal quantitative calculations or I know that there are a number of other folks out there trying to do that, and people like at Carbon Cycle Institute and Marin Carbon Project, and at the state through the Air Resources Board, there's a number of processes trying to understand carbon cycling in these forests and that. So we don't have a quantitative sense of it, but again, I would just say that we're qualitatively visualizing that all of that, the flammable carbon that we think needs to be rearranged for various functions, we're striving to retain it on site as best as possible, like I described. If we can stuff it in a gully and wet it and get it to compost in situ and become full of roots and then become carbon sequestration, that has long-term benefit. Or again, leaving it on the surface and in those contour strips to slow flow to sequester the water, the wood rat habitats that compost in place over time, the biochar for soil amendments, those other practices. So it's not quantitative. I think we're very just pragmatically trying to engage in the carbon cycle in a positive way that moves the carbon that we have in excess into the water and biology cycles versus maybe combusting it radically up in a wildfire setting into the atmosphere too quickly.
Yeah, and as John said, the soils hold far more carbon when they're healthy. And so as Brock is describing, creating that wonderful network that that improves the soil health will make it a much better carbon sink. And also, I know I threw that one to you, John, Brock, because I know that you also speak to the health of the trees, so that if you remove a lot of the smaller trees, that allows the larger trees to actually grow in a much more healthy way and therefore sequester carbon.
Yeah, I just to pile on that, I think this is one of these interesting things where in the case where we have larger individual trees that are second or third growth, but then they're overstocked with young ones, this idea in forestry of releasing the trees. So if you've only got so much food and water and sunlight at the dinner table and you've got 100 trees per unit area, thinning it down to say 10 trees that then can take advantage of those resources. Those trees can size up and cycle carbon and water and do the work of rapidly sequestering the greenhouse gas emissions and the carbon sequestration. And so it's really empowering the existing trees to be better trees. And there's also some new science looking at evapotranspiration. And these young, fast-growing, overstocked forests are pulling significant amounts of water out of the soil to support that rapid growth and appear to be having effects on in-stream flows. So the fewer trees, more forest equals possibly more carbon, more water holding capacity, more stream flow, more accessibility, less flammability, all simultaneously. And that's what we're looking for, is integrated holistic solutions that address multiple functions.
And I think that Tom's question is a really good one. And Tom, if you our role has not been to create the scientific studies. And if you were to find out more information about that, because I'm sure these studies are being done, and so I'd love it if you send me an email. We can, we're creating and I don't know, we've created a list of landowner resources that we've kind of been overwhelmed by all the information that came in the presentation. So the resources are not up to date with the presentation yet. But I think it would be great because there are many people who have your same concerns, Tom, and we'd like to be able to offer information to landowners with those same concerns. What else have we got here? There was a question that Lynn had earlier about many grazers say their goats don't like bay trees. How do you deal with the multiple bay sprouts post-fire if the deer don't graze enough of them and they keep coming back? Any experts on bay sprouts?
Yes, inadvertently, just because we've got a bay laurel dominated forest. And what we've been doing to prevent the resprouting is something affectionately termed hack and squirt, that you remove the main stem and then you apply something to discourage further regrowth. What people have been squirting has varied. Some people have used petroleum products, not recommended for fire safety. Some people use herbicide in very small amounts, but there's a lot of different things you can apply to prevent that kind of resprouting.
This is Mike. I also say something that, I've seen landowners try and what I've been experimenting with in some capacity is, if your ultimate goal is to pile burn the vegetation that you're thinning, try slash packing stumps and base stumps in particular that are resprouting. Like, so you cut the sprouts off and you have a stump that's going to resprout. If you slash pack the waste material if you slash pack those sprouts and then you kind of contour the slash packs through the forest on these areas where you're trying to suppress that regeneration, it really cooks those stumps and it suppresses the regeneration pretty significantly. It's always, it depends. There's a huge asterisk on there, but it can work. And so it's very much about timing. And when I heard Brock mention, that for broom, they kind of time when they do the treatments and they flame them with propane torches. It's the same idea as you're just trying to cook those reserves so that they suppress that regeneration. So it's a combination, right? It's integrated approach. It's not one tool is going to work every time. It's about trying multiple options, minimizing how much you do one treatment with a lot of different tools that will help you in different settings, different situations. So I think experiment with it, try what works for you. There's not like a right or wrong way to do these things. As long as you're being a steward and you're following good management practices, try different things that might work for you and see what works really well for you. At small scales, there might be options that don't really apply to larger scale. And so that might be a consideration, but experiment with it.
I'll just read something that Kim put in. Ag and Open Space has been leaving 2 liters on stumps at Calabasas Creek Open Space Preserve to ideally shade out all the other competing sprouts. I know you have a pretty big area there that burned, Kim. So we tried to get you as a panelist, and I think that was my fault that Kim is putting in his comments, and I really appreciate it, Kim. And apologies for not getting you on a panelist. And then Kim asks the question, have there been many applications of air burners for biochar production to manage the biomass coming from vegetation management treatments? I understand these require a lot of water for cooling. I'm not sure, John, John Carnegie, the Sonoma Ecology Center has if you want to speak to that, John, or maybe try to channel Raymond Baltar.
Yeah, I'm not sure I can pull that off this evening. Yeah, Sonoma Ecology Center does have a biochar program. I'm not yet super familiar with it, but we can find more information for you. What we use, I believe, are the smaller sort of portable kilns that we can set up at folks' land. So I think these air burner, air burners are larger pieces of equipment that I don't have any experience yet with at this point.
Well, I will say, and Kim, I'd be happy to put you in touch with Raymond and David Morrell, a board member, president of our board, who are working, with some pretty big grant applications, millions of dollars. And I know that he'd be able to answer that question for you.
So this is Mike, just real quick. So your traditional curtain burner, which is basically just a 4-sided box with like 1 foot thick ceramic walls and a big diesel engine that blows a curtain of air over the top, no bottom. The whole point of that is to superheat. It's basically a superheated furnace to reduce the biomass that you're burning, large pieces of biomass, down to ash very quickly. But they are creating new types of curtain burners that have the capacity to, one, they have legs, so you lift them, right? So you start the process of combustion, and then you literally lift the curtain burner off of it, move it, and then you douse, so you produce that charcoal. And they also have a really cool piece of equipment called, it's a ROI 500 carbonator. And basically what is a curtain burner up on tracks. It has a grate at the bottom, and as the wood burns to a certain size, the charcoal falls through the grate mesh into a water bath and gets conveyed out as biochar. It's a very inefficient piece of equipment. It's like 7% of the wood becomes charcoal, but it's they are thinking about how we're processing tons and immense amounts of vegetation doing these large scale forest thinning and forest health projects, and it's a really interesting challenge on what to do with that biomass. But there are certainly some cool technology out there trying to address these issues and create some byproducts from it. So it's something to be, if you're really interested in, to pay attention to. And they have smaller current burners that you can use for small projects, and homeowners can get invested into if they're interested. So the technology is coming.
Raymond has been working really hard with some of the air quality control boards to get that. But I think that our presentation is dealing a little bit more with the smaller landowners and not maybe, and I think that I think you probably missed Brock's presentation about all the various techniques. I think you had a lineup of 9 different things you could do with a slash, Brock, that I think provided a lot of options besides burning. Just restoring it to the soil.
Yeah.
So let's see. I'm scrolling around, and there's a comment here about how when you remove vegetation, and this Shigeo has said that they're on a ridge. They've taken out many of the bays, and that noticed that there's an increase in wind, and many of the remaining large healthy oak trees were breaking in the wind. Thinner oaks are a little bit more resilient and blow in the wind. I had the experience of removing a very similar situation, and the trees that had grown up with the windbreak started toppling. And I've also heard that from others. Does Brianna or Brock, do you want to speak to that at all? How to help what remains, or is your experience just simply that you haven't removed enough vegetation to create those types of winds?
I would just offer up the big "it depends" answer here and try to figure that out. I think obviously the ridgetop dwellers, it sounds like, here in this situation, or folks who are in areas that have more funneled winds, I clearly need to be more attentive to that. I mean, I think what we witness often is wind throw occurs when a forest has integrity as a group of trees. They act like a collective wind buffer, but when there's space taken out, whether that's through logging or fire or fuel load, so that they're opened up and those trees no longer have their neighbors to buffer them, I have seen, some amount of wind throw there. So I guess that's kind of a thing where in your personal situation on your property, if you know it's a highly wind prone area, you're going to be attentive to the practices and the level of thinning or the treatments that you would feel appropriate to optimize or minimize the possibility for excessive wind throw as a result of high winds. That's not a very explicit answer, but I think it's just a cautionary offering.
Oops, I was muted. I wanted to say so much of what we're talking about. I mean, one of my big points in all of this is that we have to think of the nuances. You can't. It's not just all diagrammatic. One size fits all, or the menu of things. You just pick what you want. You really do need to get to know your land and become a little more intimate with who else is living there on the land with you. But I also am aware of people who have situations like Brianna with, over 100 acres that is just so dense, and that, there must be a certain desperation about what you can do. And, we just have to work as quickly as we can. I happen to have 20 acres, and half of that is a very dense forest that's been mismanaged over time. And so I just signed up for the UC Cooperative Extension Land Stewardship Program. That may be one of the best first steps. So are there other questions? I'm sort of toggling between some that are answered, and either some people have typed answers, and many of them we have just answered right here online. Are there any other questions or any other comments that speakers might want to make at this point?
This is Mike. I just really quickly, just to follow up, I agree with everything Brock said, but I also want to just emphasize age is really important in this conversation, right? If you have bay encroaching what was traditionally, open oak woodland, and you have very old oaks, that thinning of the bay may not be, the releasing the wind and causing the damage. It may be that the oaks are just really, really old and they're starting to senesce. So that's part of thinking about how you're managing it, is that you may just have really old trees, that old oak trees drop branches, and to think about, the important thing to think about is what's replacing that old tree and those bay that you're removing, right? What's the next generation? What's establishing in that place that you're managing? Because these big trees aren't going to be here forever. They're going to die eventually. And so really thinking about the age of the trees and the age of the encroachment is going to be an important part of how you manage for this, because the younger stuff is what can replace the older stuff. What's that younger stuff? What's the composition, the structure of that younger stuff relative to the older mature trees? And think about, that's the future condition of the forest structure. So I think that's an important thing to think about and look at when you're deciding what and how to manage.
Yeah, and I think also be aware that the last couple of years there hasn't been that much rainfall, and some of the bigger oak trees are dropping limbs just because they're stressed. And so it's really important to be aware of how the climate is changing and that effect on your forest, which is why a forester is a really good person to have along to help. And I also want to mention, I'm getting a note from Hannah that she is dropping in the chat. This is a plug for our workshops. So Hannah just put another reminder, the URL for our workshops, the one for Schoen Farm and then the one at Occidental Arts and Ecology Center. Schoen Farm on the 16th and OAEC is July 19th. Is that when that is? Anyway, she just put that in the chat.
It's Santa Rosa Junior College Schoen Farm on June 18th and OAEC on July 9th.
Yeah. And anybody would like to help me out? I'm showing that I'm going through and answering all of the Q&A, but I actually frankly don't know how to delete the ones that have been answered. So if you wouldn't mind deleting for that. And there's one more question that just showed up, and Roberta gave us the 5-minute warning. So we will be ending on time, I promise. Beyond hardening the space around your home, that's where we start, not where we stop. What is the smallest scale number of acres at which it is practical to practice management with a reasonable hope that when the larger area inevitably does burn, there's a chance that your property will not simply be overwhelmed? I had actually typed an answer to this saying that hardening and the defensible space is the most important thing to ensure that your home will not burn. Hardening and the 5-foot ember-free zone. And it's really what you do in the forest. I don't know. I think that maybe Mike should answer that, or somebody else want to take that question on.
This is Mike. I can start and try. It's just, man, that's a really good question. We don't have a number for minimum. As somebody who, I'm an forest entomologist by training. I've spent my entire career thinking about forest health and integrated management of forest systems. And if we could treat as much as we could, that would be my preference, right? We want to manage these forests to return. Frankly, there isn't a healthy forest left in California because of, I'm sure you talked about the litany of things that we've kind of done to them through the last 100 years. And anything we can do that, like I mentioned, that we're not going to heavy-handed manage these systems forever. We're starting with a heavy-handed approach to get them to a more resilient, sustainable structure and condition, so that moving forward with a rapidly changing climate and the way we interact with the forest, they're more healthy and sustainable and persist. And so I think, if you have a small property, you treat as much of it as you can to the property line, or maybe you have a collaborative with your neighborhood and you treat large, high priority areas. It's really about prioritizing areas that are most important. And that's where the forest management plan comes into play, because it helps you think about your property on the whole, a holistic approach, and think about where would a shaded fuel break be really valuable from a defensive mechanism for having firefighters come out here, or where do I think a fire might come and I want to reduce the amount of potential embers that will come from that burning vegetation that we're blowing into my defensible space and structure hardening. And so it's really about thinking strategically, high priority areas, what is feasible, right? You're not going to treat on really steep ground because maybe it's too expensive, or maybe it's impossible ground to work on. So you're going to prioritize those areas that are high value and accessible and will have a strategic value. And also you're thinking about two different things. One, you're thinking about wildfire safety and protection of your infrastructure, your home, your life and property. And then as you're moving to different parts of your land, maybe you're more thinking about ecological processes and managing for those kinds of ecosystem services that we think about that are part of a complex, healthy, dynamic forest system. So it's such a cop-out, but I'm going to say it depends. It entirely depends on your goals and objectives, on a lot of the site and the vegetation, and kind of a lot of things go into thinking about. This is why it's so important to have a good conversation with a bunch of folks who are resource professionals, because this is what they think about all day long and they can help you make those decisions. But it's not an easy answer, and it's something that we're constantly thinking about and trying to evaluate to help us better understand how we can actively steward these forests and natural resources for health, but also at the same time thinking about the utilitarian perspective in which we live in these systems and have different values associated with them.
Sorry, muted again. I just got a note from Roberta saying that it's time to wrap up. And so I think that, besides the message about sign up for our workshops, and if any landowner, if any of you out there would like to be in the West County zone, would like to be sort of a guinea pig for our lightning consultation, which we will have in the fall or the late, I don't have the dates in front of me, but it would be great if we had a landowner who was willing to have their one or two or even three landowners who'd be willing to have their property kind of go through a process. And then at the end, we could present that property and show what that landowner has learned. And man, I'm going to sign up for that myself because I live in West County and I qualify, but I encourage other people to as well. So thank you to all our panelists, and any last minute comments? If not, I think we can sign off.
Just want to say thank you, everyone, for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
For those of us who are left, I see that Kim Batchelder is typing an answer to a comment from Tom Conlon, and I'm really curious to see what he's saying.
Kim, we made Kim a panelist per your request. Just be aware of that.
No.
And also, Mason, stop the video now if you haven't already.
Does